Welcome to the Leadmore podcast. I'm your host, John T. Meyer. The Leadmore podcast is the show where we talk to and get to know leaders of today to inspire more leaders for tomorrow. I believe the world needs more leaders, and in this episode, we talked about a topic that everyone's talking about, remote work. I called up the person that I know knows the most about remote work. She is an expert on the subject. Her name is Laurel Farrer. She is the CEO of Distribute Consulting and the founder of the Remote Work Association. She's worked remotely for over a decade, long before it was the hot, popular thing to do. She helps companies like Microsoft and Slack and Zoom work with their teams to better work remotely. So in this episode, we talked about this trend. Is it here to stay? What does it look like in the future? We talked about her favorite tools for remote work and how to be a better leader while working remotely. You're going to love this conversation. Let's get right to it. Well, welcome to the Leadmore podcast. I'm so excited today for today's conversation here with Laurel Farrer. Laurel, you started the Distribute Consulting and also the founder of Remote Work Association. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, you bet. And if it weren't for COVID times, I suppose I would have to ask you where the heck you are, because you're probably always on the go. So tell us where you're calling from.
Yeah, I'm just at home. I'm in my farmhouse in upstate Connecticut.
Cool. And you, just like you would assume someone who is big into and a thought leader around remote work, you've lived sort of all over the country, right?
Yeah. We were, I wouldn't necessarily call us digital nomads, but we were flexible in our in our location when we had little kids, and we were able to move to different opportunities to help build our careers. And we were, a young family. We were able to do that. However, it was about 2 or 3 years ago that our kids were getting a little bit older and needing a bit more stability. And, we were wanting to plant some roots. And so we did come here to Connecticut to stabilize for our children's adolescence. But I have a feeling that as soon as they are in college, my husband and I are going to fly the coop again.
That's great. So I know what you do. What does he do that allows you sort of this flexibility?
Yeah, he does business development. So he's been a business development consultant for a long time. So that is what enabled us to move around. Is he was able to move to his clients and for short-term contracts. It was great and made him even more valuable in his job.
Cool. That's one thing I've been sort of a silver lining, I guess, of COVID is, as an entrepreneur, I always think the real reason you become an entrepreneur is the freedom, right? The ability to kind of control your own destiny and go where you want to go. But my partner, my wife, has a pretty traditional job, a great job, but more of a traditional organization. But now they're learning too that, maybe this remote work thing does work, right? And so we're already thinking like, how do we get out of this South Dakota winter that's on its way, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit addicting. I do have to say we get in trouble with the schools a lot because our kids aren't in school as much as they need to be. And we're like, whatever, like we're taking them on business trips. They're going to all of these museums, experiencing incredible cultures. Like we think that we're giving them even more of an education, but the traditional school system doesn't see it that way. So that was another motivating factor to plant roots of like, okay, we actually have to be good parents.
Attendance. Yeah. Well, let's kind of dig into the seed of where this came from, whether it was a travel addiction or just like hey, this works. Like, so tell me, when did you first get kind of this, I don't even know how to describe it, but I guess what was your first job, I guess, that out of college? Let's start there.
Yeah, right out of, we're digging deep here. My first job out of college was an interior designer. I studied, I had a dual major of business management and interior design. And so I operated an interior design firm.
And I'm guessing that was more traditional. You were in the office, so you weren't working remotely. There's no Zoom calls.
No, that was 100% on site.
And then just walk us through a little bit some of the journey, because I think a lot of one thing we've learned from the show is that a leader's path can be kind of winding. It's maybe not as a blueprint as sometimes we think that it is, right? So tell us a little bit about your journey to where you are today.
Yeah, well, it was actually my next job after that. So after I worked in that design firm, that's when I I was disenchanted with interior design as a career. I had been doing it for several years, but I was like, I want to have more impact on people's lives. And when I started doing that on a day-to-day basis, that's when I realized that it's not as picturesque as you think it's going to be. As we all kind of,
Sure.
I think we all do that with our first
Every
jobs,
job.
right?
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And I was like, oh, I'm just hanging pictures on the wall and, throwing toss pillows and to the couch. Like, this is not quite the impact that I want to have in people's lives. And so my next job was operating an event planning agency. There was still a really heavy design element to it, and all of the logistical coordination and business management that I loved, but it was a bit more emotional and a bit more mission driven. Like you're planning this really important event for corporations or for people. And so it had a bit more psychological fulfillment for me. However, that was a big tipping point in my career, because it was that company. I was operating that business again as the COO. And that's when we hit a stage of growth that we needed to move into the bigger office. But it was an event coordination industry. And so there's a high season, there's a low season. And during the high season, it is pretty hypocritical to have an office building at all, because you're never in it. You're always at the event sites.
Sure.
Yeah. And so I was, young, eager to prove myself in this company. And I was saying, I think we're going to waste a lot of money if we get this new, bigger office in preparation for the high season. What if we all just worked? It wasn't even work from home, right? It was just like, well, let's just not have an office. Let's just meet at event sites and stuff for the high season, and then we'll get the office at the end. And so that was my first bite of remote work. And so at the end of that season, we were looking over the expenses, and we all loved working from home. We were able to continue operations just as well as we did before. And we were like, there's no reason not to do this. So, but that was 14 years ago. So that was the beginning of my remote work journey.
Skype, email.
Not even that.
No,
like we
Skype
didn't have video calls. No cloud docs, nothing. So it was emails and meetings, and that was about it. And it was not cool then. Like, there is no way that we would ever tell one of our clients that we didn't have an office, because we would never
taboo,
be taken
right?
seriously. Yeah. Like, you're not a credible business if you don't have a storefront. And so we would play it off as good customer service, and we'd be like, oh, we'll come to you, or let's meet up for coffee or whatever. But especially as a woman-owned business, like, not a chance. We're not going to tell them anything. But when people did find out, it sparked a lot of questions, like, oh, how does that work? And how do you guys not have an office? And what do you do about this? And just by nature, as I continued to evolve in my own career. I continued as COO of different event coordination agencies, and always worked remotely. I would convert the business, or I would convert my role or whatever.
So I'm guessing usually the driver was cost savings. That was probably the pitch, right? To get people
absolutely,
to buy in.
Yeah. And talent retention, sure. and access. In fact, the last business that I worked for in that industry, that was the entire business model, was event coordination. But when people are planning corporate events and flying your event staff to each location, is really, really expensive. So we kind of created this freelancer network of event coordinators that wherever your event is, will staff your event with local staff. And it was great. Loved that business model. But that's how it all evolved, as I continued to be operations managers of all of these companies. And then in that last company is when I really started getting hungry for resources of like leadership development and virtual organizational behavior and things like that, for distributed companies specifically. And I kept digging and digging and digging, and they didn't exist. Unfortunately, that last company had a really toxic culture, and it started to branch into like terrible health and wellness for me, as well as illegal operations. And I was like, I'm out. Like, I'm a very honest, ethical person. And so I unexpectedly quit one day and had the whole morning after thing of like, oh no, like, what am I going to do now? And so thinking about like, this is a fresh start for my career. What do I want to do? And I knew that that's what I wanted to do. Like, I want to create those resources for distributed teams that don't exist. And that
That's
was the
great.
birth of me as an independent contractor, which then evolved into distributed consulting as an agency and as a community of remote work experts.
So I've only known you online as like the remote lady. That's kind of, I'm like, I go to her for questions. I mean, we met on a podcast maybe 3 or 4 years ago where you interviewed
Yeah.
me. So timestamp when that was that you decided to become an independent contractor, because obviously even then I'm sure remote work was still sort of taboo. It still wasn't cool. It still was difficult. The tools weren't great. Like what time was this?
Yeah, that was actually a very, very similar time. So that was Yonder was that was the Yonder podcast, and that was
Yeah.
one of my first contracts of they were trying to have this conversation, trying to, create awareness of remote work and distributed teams. And so that's what I was hired to do was operate that as a brand, build it up, and really create a bunch of content. Because at that point I had been doing remote work. I mean, I had been calling it remote work, but I had been doing that for over a decade. And so when I would talk to other people, I'd be like, oh, I'm so excited to learn from you. I've only been doing this for a decade. And they're like, what? Like,
A decade? Yeah.
like I was in middle school. I'm like, yeah, oh, okay, great. So it was this moment of realizing that, oh, I keep looking for these answers, feeling like there's an expert out there, but it turns out that I'm the expert, and I didn't. There was a lot of imposter syndrome with that, and not thinking that I had valuable information to share, because it had been such an organic, natural development in my career that I didn't really feel like it was anything special. But especially over the past couple of years, as more and more people have needed this information, you realize how rare and valuable your knowledge is.
Yeah, let's dig into that a little bit if you're willing, because I feel like sometimes
Of course.
leaders don't know they're even seen as leaders, right? Until someone maybe tells them, or we've heard on this podcast several times, there's these people in our lives who kind of nudge us or push us forward to step up and be that leader. So you're thinking, hey, I feel like I know a few things, but maybe, I'm just a beginner. Like, was there a moment? Was there a conversation? Was there a validation point that you said, I'm good at this. I can do this?
To be honest, I think that's ongoing.
Sure.
So it was when I, like in those early days of being a consultant, that I was, just picking up freelancing gigs and consulting, small businesses, writing articles for Yonder, that I was like, oh, I know the answers. Like, people keep asking me questions and I know the answers. Like, oh, I didn't realize that this was information that people needed and that they didn't know themselves. So that was kind of the birth and the evolution of me specifying what my niche was. But then it just continued to evolve too. A big hurdle that I had to go through and go overcome in my leadership and my confidence as a leader was, I kept waiting for somebody to rescue me, right? Like, there's somebody else that does this better than me, and I'm going to wait for them to appear so that I can just help them, instead of having that independence and that confidence of, I am the expert. I can do this myself. And I'm still overcoming that. That's still, I think once you're a COO, that's just the role that you fall into, is like, oh, I'm the second person,
Yeah,
right? Like,
you're the
I'm the right
operator.
hand. Yeah. So falling into the CEO role has been
Interesting.
really tough for me. And there's a lot of imposter syndrome there of like, no, I'm not, I don't want to be the face. I don't want to be, but then, and then I think with COVID, honestly, it was a kind of a make or break situation, because the conversation about remote work boomed, not even boomed, exploded. So the industry in general expanded by about 10 years in the space of 2 weeks. I mean, it was insane. We went from just trying to have conversations with businesses of, maybe you consider this as an option, just pushing them to conduct a trial or just hear a report.
Would
All
that
of a
be
sudden,
even like the start of 2020, like even in
yeah,
January?
that was
It was
February.
still,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then 2 weeks later, every Fortune 500 company, every government, every size of business and every single industry needed this information immediately. And in February, we were having conversations as a business of like, is this viable to be niche consultants on remote work? Like, I just don't think there's the demand. We were thinking about closing. And
Wow.
then in March, our leads increased by 6,000% in the first month. So we're like, oh, okay, but then that's brought its own set of problems, right?
Sure,
Like, how
sure.
do we
Yeah.
stay relevant in this market? How do we compete? Because all of a sudden we went from this tiny, barely surviving consultancy with 5 people to competing with Deloitte and in two
Sure,
weeks. Like it was
sure.
just, yeah.
So
So
the pie grew, but I'm sure the competition grew too. And there are other people
absolutely.
now saying, "Hey, I'm a remote work consultant."
Oh, everybody. I mean, the companies that we had been begging to just say like, hey, would you be willing to like speak at an event or something and just say that you have remote workers? They were like, absolutely not. No way. And then 2 weeks later, they're releasing guides of like,
Oh,
oh,
a
we're remote work
webinar.
experts. Yeah. And it was like, oh, like it was so frustrating. So you have the opportunistic,
Oh yeah.
hungry market definitely followed. But yeah, that was also when that was a big benchmark for me personally in my confidence of like, hey, okay, like it opened up incredible opportunities that I didn't anticipate,
Good.
like being on NPR and BBC and now every single publication like Entrepreneur and Fast Company and Inc. and Forbes, like all of those are now my name is on all of those, and it's like, oh, okay, I guess
Now
I have something to say. So
that's
yeah,
great.
it's
That's
it's
great.
ongoing. It's always a battle of fighting that imposter syndrome. Yeah, I think the more that we expose ourselves and allow ourselves, I'm very, very non-competitive. I like to a fault. Like I don't like competition whatsoever. So I think I remove myself from the market a lot. But
Sure.
I've found that it's good to stay in the market a little bit so that you have that understanding of competition of like, oh, this is what I offer that's unique and beneficial and helps you gain that confidence.
Yeah, and I think as your leads would attest to, is it's not a zero sum game, right? Like lots of people can win in this. We all are going to need some
Yeah.
help when it comes to moving remote, and every company is going to have some element of it. And so I want to get to in a little bit kind of what you're telling leaders right now in a remote work world, but tell us just briefly sort of what Distribute does. So we mentioned content, like how do you help a business when now in May 1st, if they call you and say, oh my gosh, we're now remote, what do we do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So change management has definitely been far and away the number one service for so far in 2020. So we're helping them convert their operations. So build a virtual infrastructure of tools that will create that virtual office feeling
Mm-hmm.
for their team members. We're teaching them how to manage and supervise results and understand how to measure productivity without supervision. We're teaching them how to build culture and unity as virtual teams. We are writing remote work policies. We're doing all of that
Okay.
stuff, right?
Yeah.
The difference being what most people do or have done is they go remote, meaning they only change their workplace. They send people home and they are changing the location of their workers, and that's all. The difference of what we provide is that workplace change is not a sustainable change. It's not going to do anything to employee experience or to operations. So we enhance the conversation to virtual organizational development and identifying what changes and updates need to be made at the company level in order to prevent discrimination, prevent policy retraction, maintain compliance. We do the unsexy side of remote work.
That's usually a good place to be in most businesses,
Yeah,
the
hopefully.
unsexy stuff. Um, okay, so what have you? Let's tell some. You know, you don't have to use company names, but maybe you have a shining example of a great like a great star in a post kind of COVID remote transition, and maybe a interesting or sort of a horror story of people who have really faltered. I mean, now we're all kind of I think humans, we underestimate how adaptable we are, and we
Yeah.
start to really just get used to this new normal.
Mhm.
But what was it like talking to some of these companies in March, April?
Oh, it was shocking because a lot of the companies that we had worked with previously, we were, they had found us as remote work consultants because they were already thinking about remote work.
Sure.
So they already had an openness to the topic. Um, and then in March, it went to all ends of the spectrum. And so we were very, very, very surprised at people that had never considered remote work as an option were now needing to operate as a fully distributed company. And just the mindset shift it was pretty alarming, is pretty alarming,
Sure.
on a daily basis, just not understanding basic fundamentals of tools like Google, or they are calling their employees every 15 minutes and saying, what have you done for the past 15
Oh.
minutes? Because they need that supervision, that feeling
Yeah.
of visibility. There's no understanding of like how to access the internet at all, like even open a browser. So yes, on one hand, we were trying to help companies optimize virtual operations, but then on the other hand, we're trying to give like remedial technology education as well. So it really diversified our target market by a lot. And so in terms of like a shining star, the interesting part about that conversation is we won't know for a while because
Sure.
anybody can go remote. Even people that have never opened Google before, anybody can go remote, and do it pretty successfully for about 3 to 6 months. It's after 3 to 6 months that the workplace change, like I was mentioning before, that's when that no longer is relevant and enough. And then it becomes a much deeper conversation about how does the company need to be updated. So anybody can go remote. It's who's going to be able to be sustainable. That's the conversation that we want, that we all should be paying attention to. Who sees this as an opportunity and really rises to the occasion. So we'll see. That's yet to be
Mm-hmm.
determined. But I will say that Microsoft has done an incredible job. There was a lot of competitors and a lot of tools out there like Slack that were all trying to be the hub office of
Yep.
remote
Yep.
teams, and Microsoft, I think, has blown the competition out of the water since COVID launched. They are continually releasing new features that just make more sense.
And do you mean from a software provider, as in like the Teams tool, or as just a company?
Both.
Both. Okay.
So we were in touch with them prior to COVID. They do have a head of remote because they have a very remote workforce.
Huge company. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I think over 60% of their workforce was remote prior to COVID. And so I think that's what's enabled them to do a very, very good job in updating their software to match the needs of virtual teams, is because they live it and breathe it. And whereas other competitors like that are now our clients like Slack and Zoom, they don't get it. Like, yes, their tools are used by remote workers, every single remote worker in the world, but they didn't live it and breathe it.
Isn't that
And
ironic?
so, so once that shifted, and they needed to update their functionality immediately in order to meet the needs of their market, then they were like, well, what do we do? Like, how do we
Yeah.
do this? But Microsoft was able to just say, all right, let's do it. Let's roll
Huh.
this out. So yeah, it's, and that's kind of an evolution point in our business as well. Is yes, we focused on change management, but we now do a lot of that as well, which is subject matter expertise for companies. Like, we now, post COVID, it's estimated that at least 1/3 of the United States workforce will continue to work remotely permanently.
Okay.
That's an increase from 3% at the beginning of the year. So it is an incredible
Yeah, 10x
incredible
at
boom.
least. Yeah.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
insane. And that's a minimum of 30%. So now every single company needs to understand how to design products for distributed teams, how to market to distributed teams. What are the pain points? How do we, connect with leaders and users that understand this as a work model? So that's a lot of what we do, as well as helping develop that subject matter expertise and create marketing materials, or just teach leaders like, okay, you need to go give a presentation about remote work. Let's teach you about what remote
Yeah.
work is, so
Yeah.
that you sound like you know what you're talking about. So yeah, it's been an interesting spin and an interesting expansion of our services, but we love it.
Awesome. Good for you guys. I think that wait and see point is interesting because even although, our first employee at Lemonly in 2011 was based in Serbia. And so
Mhm.
we've been remote for, at some point, it's never been more than about a quarter of our employees, but for 9 years almost. And so our company kind of grew up trying to figure out how to do remote, or how to, I always like to say, scale culture beyond four walls.
Yeah.
Um, so it felt like pretty natural to us. But I've been interested. I've been kind of, that's the word I'm looking for. It's almost laughable, some of the hot takes of like how bold people were in May and June about like, I will never go to an office again, or I will, this company will be remote forever. And I think you're right about that. Like, let's give it more than 6 months, because I am curious what, we've been remote, and right now you can come in if you want, but people just seem to be pretty happy at home, and we want to be safe, and that's cool. But don't you think there's going to be some desire for human connection and face to face and water cooler? And I just think some of these companies may kind of level off in the middle, or where do you think people will fall by the end of this?
Yeah, I think that that's often why I'm referred to as the remote work mom, is because I'm like that level head of reason for all of the other advocates that are like, remote work is the best, or like, if you ever go into an office, you're a shame to society. Like, they just polarize and they're so
Yeah.
extreme. And I'm like, children, calm down. Like, that's I'm like, that's not realistic. Like, that would destroy our economy if everybody went remote all of a sudden. Like, if every company became distributed overnight because of COVID, like, what would that do to real estate? Like, come on, guys, have a brain.
Sure. Sure.
So it's like, okay, let's realize that reality is going to be a baby step, and that the goal of remote work is, and remote work advocates and thought leaders, is not to make every single business virtual immediately. The ultimate goal is that location becomes irrelevant, that location doesn't matter, that work is something that we do, not somewhere that we go. And so that means that we can leverage location as an asset in our productivity, which means we might need to go into HQ in order to be more productive for a specific task. But it also means that if we need to, we can be at a client's office, or in an airport, or at our home office, or a co-working space, and be equally as productive. So it means that business operations are able to continue regardless of the location of the workers. So, yeah, that's what most people don't understand. And they go so extreme of like, oh,
Yeah.
this is, and it's like, that's not
And that's
realistic. So
that's powerful when you can start thinking about, batching your task on a Tuesday, and a Tuesday is the day that you do go in, or maybe
exactly.
Mondays are your meeting days. So you do, virtual or whatever you need, but that's
Yeah,
where the real
so
power
much
happens.
more. Yeah, so much more flow, so much more productivity, so much more efficient collaboration, because you're not just together all the time. You're like, okay, we've got the next 6 hours together in person. Let's make it count. And you're so much more productive as a team. Like, that is, is it the ideal situation? It doesn't matter, because there is no ideal situation. It depends on what each company wants and what each company needs. How distributed do they need to be? How local do they need to be? That's going to differ based on workflows, on natural resources, on cultural expectations, on future regulations. Like, there is no right answer, and it makes it hard for people to understand what the future of remote work looks like, because they want it to be very formulaic. They want it to be very clean and concise. Like, okay, we're going to be in the office or out of the office,
Yeah,
or,
sure.
these are the workers that go on site. These are the workers that don't. And it's like, It's not like that. It's your choice. The future of work is about empowerment and flexibility, and that includes at the organizational level. Like, you get to choose what this looks like for you, and that's stressful for a lot of companies.
But also exciting, right? That's cool.
Yeah, hopefully.
and you're right. Nobody would probably say 2020 and ideal in the same sentence, right? So
no.
I think you're right about that. Well, I don't want to like oversimplify your expertise or your business, but if a leader is listening to this podcast, do you have sort of like the stone tablets, or like, what are the 5 things that like we need to be considering as leaders in a remote work world?
Yeah. I always start with write a policy, because that policy will, yes, it will make your workers compliant, but more so it puts everybody on the same page, because you have to think about, oh, are we going to pay stipends for equipment, or are we not? Or are we going to require that certain roles are on site or not? Or are we going to, provide travel reimbursement or whatever? Like, all of the elements of that you need to think about in order to facilitate long-term remote work change, you have to think about in order to write the policy. So I think that's where I always start with our clients, is because
That's
it
good.
forces them to think through all of the bullet points of change management. So that's number one, is write a policy. We do have a free template or a checklist on our website at distributeconsulting.com, and people are welcome to download that and get that conversation started. Because it's not just like, yes, I agree to work off site, but it's like, okay, what are performance expectations? What warrants discipline? What, like, all of those need to be discussed. So that's number one. But the number 2 is get to know the virtual working styles of your team members. We knew exactly what was expected of us in an office. We show up at 9, we take a break at noon, we leave at 5, we sit at our cubicle where, we take a break to go to the break room, but not too many. Like, we knew exactly what we needed to do in order to look productive and to be active and engaged. And we have to completely redefine that for a virtual work environment. We have to say, okay, does it mean that you're online during these times? Does it mean that you answer phone calls when I call? Or does it mean that you produce a certain deliverable by the end of the day? Like, what does this mean in our organization? So articulating what those performance standards are and getting to know the working styles of your team members, so that you understand, like, oh yeah, this person, they're super active in Slack. They're always, talking and communicating with other people, so that if they are not active on Slack one day, that something's wrong, and to go
That's good.
to go connect with them. Otherwise, nobody has any way of raising their hand and asking for help. I mean, that's the equivalent of them like crying at their desk. So we need to be paying attention to new nonverbal communication like that.
That's really good. Yeah, I like that. And do you then have, Lemonly, we're a little smaller. We're 16 employees, so we know everybody, and we've always had some degree of remote, but we're not in next to each other anymore. Do you then create like almost like a profile, or like, I know that these people are kind of like, pair it with like personality type, strengths finder type of thing? Like, how would you encourage a leader to sort of check in on everybody? Because I think that's where I felt different. Like, we've had a really great productive summer. Lemonly's been busy. I trust my people, but I definitely feel more distant from them. Like, just the small little, like, I can see pictures on Instagram or like know what they maybe did over the weekend, but I just don't really feel like some of the connection. So talk about that.
Yeah, it's so important to create that space. So everything in remote work and distributed companies is about intention and discipline, because things don't just happen organically, right? Like, I remember going out to lunch every Wednesday with my team members. I don't know how it started. It just kind of happened. Like, we happened to do it a few Wednesdays in a row, and then all of a sudden it was a big tradition and a really critical core to our culture. And so the same thing, we need those same interactions, the interpersonal interactions with our team members and distributed teams, but they're not going to necessarily happen organically. We have to intentionally create the time and space for those. So yes, it is so important to not force it and be like, guess what we're going to do? We're going to take a cooking class together, but to pay attention to, like, hey, we talk about food a lot in our calls, like opening up 5 to 10 minutes for just casual chatting in meetings, paying attention to what people talk about, and then making a suggestion and be like, you know what we should do? We should take a skill share cooking class together, and it's all virtual, and let's do it. Like that would
Yeah.
be so fun. And just letting things naturally evolve, but reserving that time and budget for culture development and virtual team building is so important. But yeah, just creating. I like to say that if you can't talk about puppies, you can't talk about profit. So you do need to have those
Yeah.
conversations with each other, but you have to create the space for them to happen.
Well, I think remote work, I think inherently is pretty efficient. Truth, I think people think the opposite, but it's really not true, because it cuts out a lot of the noise or some of this office chatter or just distractions. But then
Mm-hmm.
I sometimes worry that then my relationship or these Slack messages become very transactional. It's like you write when you
Yeah.
need something,
Yeah. It's
you
a work
message when you're
only.
exactly, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and it becomes very like one dimensional, which is not the type of work environment we want to create.
Yeah, it needs to be balanced. We need to create space for both, and it enhances that engagement as well. People are more loyal, more connected to their jobs, more creative in their jobs if they feel individually valued and recognized. That's a big mistake that a lot of companies make, is they think of those lunches out or the ping pong tables as company culture. And
Yep.
yes, those are expressions or activities based on culture, but they're not the culture itself. The culture is where people feel unified, they feel aligned, they feel visible and recognized and appreciated. That's true culture. So if we strip that back to that conversation, we remember that people feeling connected to each other has nothing to do with proximity. Yes, we spend a lot of time together, but I can be sitting right next to somebody else and feel completely alone and disconnected and invisible.
Yeah.
So, how we create that true connection and engagement with our teams is by being very open and transparent and trusting and empathetic, and sensitive to each other. That's what creates that true company culture, regardless of location.
That's so good. Good stuff. I want to ask you briefly about synchronous versus asynchronous. So I read this
Yes.
article that said there's I think, was it a Vox article? And it was a really long article about the difference between remote friendly and remote first. And as a
Mhm.
company who, on March 13th, or whatever that Friday was, that most of us went remote, we sort of snapped our fingers. We told people, take your stuff home. I think later on, people came back and got their nice chair after they realized this was more than just a couple of weeks.
Right.
Um, but like overnight, we felt like it actually went pretty well. But then we started to realize, like, we're probably more in that remote friendly category. Like certainly for our folks who have lived in Vancouver, New York City, Miami, they have a different Lemon experience than those of us at HQ. So how do we move to this remote first? And the article talked a lot of it about being asynchronous, this idea that we don't have to be on connected to our tools, that little green light on Slack, 24/7. So how do you help companies? I think it's first go remote, and then almost to get to that next level, it's like that
Mhm.
asynchronous level. What do you think on that front?
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's three primary differences between remote work and co-located work that we help leaders understand, what is the gap here that they're trying to bridge. And that's results-based tracking, virtual office infrastructure, and asynchronous communication. This is really what sets remote work apart, is this mentality that you can be collaborating as a team, you can be working together as a group without being in the same place at the same time, because that's what facilitated the Zoom fatigue post-COVID, right? Is that everybody was like, okay, well, if we're working together, we have to be together. We have to be in this real-time mentality. We have to be talking about it all the time. And so everybody was just jumping from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting, and forgetting that you can still work together as a group in different times. And when they open their mind to that and they say, oh, that's true, then it unlocks this whole new, like, Harry Potter world of superpowers, right? That you're like, wait a second, that means I, as a leader, can be in multiple places at the same time. And then that's where you find your superpower as a manager. Like, my favorite tool in the world is Loom. It's where you can record
Yes.
your video and your screen. I use that absolutely on a daily basis because it allows me to train my team to like walk through, debrief them on a new project, or to, walk through a new deliverable that I created, or introduce some new content or whatever. And we also use Marco Polo, which is a video messaging app. Same concept, right? Like, I can talk to my team at the same time that I'm in a meeting with a client. And so that they're getting information from me, they're getting trained from me, and they're getting guidance and advice from me at a time that synchronously I'm booked up somewhere else. And not only that for that day, but then I can record those trainings and use them elsewhere. And so I can be training a new hire in 6 months with the exact same material, and I don't have to repeat myself later. So yeah, then it just, our ability to be a manager and to share our knowledge and advice as leaders just grows exponentially when we embrace the power of asynchronous communication.
Yeah, it's like you're cloning yourself, at that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. Cool. I'm going to finish with some rapid fire, but I had one more that I wanted to ask you, sort of as a thought leader in this space, which you certainly are. What does this look like a year from now? Right? Like, let's assume that we will get past COVID. I'm a big believer in the human ingenuity and innovation and science and technology, and we just got to kind of stick together and get through this. So what is this trend? What does work look like in 2022, late 2021? I want to hear your prediction.
What we are noticing with our clients is exactly like we were talking about before. Hybrid is absolutely the new normal. So it's the baby step that our society is taking in order to understand what workplace flexibility can eventually become. Essentially the return to work model that we're seeing across the board is we will continue to have an office, but it's going to become more of a co-working space. People will go in for specific events, specific meetings, specific tasks, and then the rest of the time they get to choose where they want to work, which is primarily going to be from home. Most of the surveys that we're sending out to the internal workforces are all pretty equally. 80 to 85% of the workforces want to continue working from home permanently. And so we're just building return to work plans that accommodate that.
Cool. And I guess I lied one more, because now I selfishly need to know, how does that then change the office? How are you telling people to think about a hybrid model? Should we be downsizing our office, or should we just be changing the way they lay out, or what are you telling folks there?
Well, this takes us full circle to interior design, doesn't it? So yeah, it's that's the big question that I keep getting, right? Is like, is this the death of the office? And it's like, no, this is not the death of the office. So yes, if we use offices is not going to go anywhere anytime soon. How we use offices is going to be the new conversation. So yes, the layout will change to be much more open concept. I mean, those were already on an upswing already with open concept offices. That might change a little bit because of healthcare restrictions, but depending on what healthcare looks like next year and social distance, or I should say physical distancing.
Yeah.
That might be incorporated, but yeah, people will go into the office for group activities, a lot of collaboration, decision making, strategic thinking, to use heavy equipment, to use shared equipment, or really expensive tools or things like that, and then everything else will be offsite. And so it'll just be a big, much more flexibility in workplace. The interesting thing is not so much how that's going to change our relationship with the office, but how that's going to impact our socioeconomics. So that means that rush hours could be a thing of the past. That means that economic development is turning upside down because people are leaving urban environments because they don't have to be right next to those big employers, which could rescue the Rust Belt of the Midwest United States. It's in completely influencing diversity, equity, and inclusion. This changes education. There's not rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods. All kids get access to the same education if it's virtual. There's so many ripple effects there to think about and to discuss. So those are the favorite projects that we work on at Distribute, are those big picture socioeconomic impact projects that we get to just strategize and figure out how we can save the world using virtual jobs.
I love it. Yeah, I think maybe we'll have to do an episode next year again, a follow-up, a part 2.
Let's do it. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. So I'd like to know what makes leaders tick. And so we'll do a little rapid fire here. I don't know if you're a reader or not, but what are you reading right now?
Oh, I am a reader, and I am reading such a great book. It's I'm not a foodie, but I love food. So I'm not like a snob about it. I just eat all of it.
Just enjoy it. Yep. Fair.
Yeah. And I also love nonfiction books. And so I'm reading a nonfiction about food. It's called 8 Flavors. And it's talking about the 8 different spices that have influenced American history of cuisine. It's so good. It's so fascinating. So that's been my decompression every day.
Perfect. And maybe you just answered it, because my next question is, in a pandemic, mental health is a priority. How do you said you have kids, how do you unplug? How do you de-stress?
Yeah, I think it's important for each remote worker to have like a wind up and a wind down, like a log in, log off routine, because that really replaces the commute and helps our mind separate between work and life. It helps us get into work mode and get out of work mode so that we can be more present in work and more present in life. So I do have just a quick, like 5 to 10 minute routine in the morning and in the afternoon that helps me separate my work hours. And so typically in the morning, that just looks like I just go work out for a little bit and then make breakfast and then come upstairs and log on for the day. In the evening, I clear off my desk. There's something psychological about that I clear everything off, go into my room, which is just right across the hall, go into my bedroom just for a little bit before I say hi to my kids and just get out of my work headspace, so that I'm still not trying to figure out, how to format that document when I'm talking to them about their school day, So I do a headspace meditation or read a chapter of a book or just sit there and or like catch up on Marco Polos with friends or something like that, but do something to help bridge the gap. And then I go downstairs and it's family time after that.
Good for you. Yeah. I found my wife and I have both said this, that we're actually working more, right? Like lunch is now just like, make a sandwich in the kitchen and then kind of come back down and sit. And then it's just so hard. Those lines do blur really quickly. Yeah.
Burnout is incredibly, incredibly common in remote workers for that reason. Most managers are afraid that people will only watch Netflix all day, right? But the irony is that it's opposite. Yeah. Remote workers work 2 to 4 hours a day more than they did in the office.
Whoa.
Yeah.
How's it 2 to 4?
Yeah, 2 to 4. Yeah. Both in quantity and quality. So not just in time, but also you're getting into that deeper headspace. So you're working harder. And so even if you're working the same amount of hours, you're coming out just exhausted. So yeah, it's a slippery slope.
Fascinating. You mentioned your children. Parents are incredible leaders in my mind. So what's a parenting tip you would give to any parents listening? It doesn't have to involve remote work, but
right. Well, that's funny because one of my greatest parenting tips is that that we operate our family as a distributed team. I had that realization a couple of years ago that I was like, wait a second, I'm crushing it in operating a business, but I feel like a failure as a mom. What can I learn from my professional self to enhance my personal self? And I was like, wait a second, my goal as a boss is to understand, what everybody's working on, how do they need support from me, make sure that they feel connected and trusted by me. Like that's my goal. isn't that my goal as a mom as well? So yeah, on our best days, we're not perfect, of course, but on our best days, we have like a stand-up meeting in the mornings, like,
Cool.
okay, what is everybody working on today? What are your goals for today? And in the evening, we do the same thing, like, did you accomplish your goals? And what are you proud of today? And what are you going to be working on tomorrow? And we just sync up, make sure that our calendars are aligned and that we all understand what is going on with each other and stay connected, even though, we're all in different places and working on different things throughout the day.
Cool. I love that. This is a special one for you. I haven't asked other people this. You've mentioned some of the key, we know the main players, the Slacks, the Zooms, the Microsoft Teams, but then you mentioned a Loom. I was just curious, is there any cool, like maybe off the grid, off the radar tool that you really like that makes remote work better, easier, more fun?
Oh man, there's some cool stuff that's coming up. I will say that. Especially with now that it's so much easier for startups to get funding for remote tools, because now everybody sees that there's
The
opportunity
yeah.
there. Yeah, that there's a hot market. So there's some good stuff. I think CRISP is really good. KRISP. It
The phone
mutes the
calls,
background.
right?
Yeah, and it is impressive. I was a naysayer for a while, but our team members started using it, and I was blown away with what a difference it makes. So that enables people to have kids in the background or be working from a coffee shop or something like that without interrupting their professionalism. So I think that one's really great. And I know that a lot of bigger tools are starting to incorporate that technology. So we'll be seeing that a lot more often. I love Kona, Kona, which is it is like a virtual behavior analysis. It plugs into Slack and tells you kind of how to manage your team members. Like, this person likes asynchronous communication. They like to have information before a meeting so that they can think through their thoughts prior to saying them in front of a group. Or this person it really likes spontaneous thinking and creativity. So be sure to give them more of those assignments, stuff like that.
Cool.
So yeah, I
like
love Kona. Yeah, I could go on and on, but those two are the first that popped into my head.
Cool.
With Loom, I have to always say Loom. I love Loom so much.
Well, and Loom is like, maybe the pain point is felt more with COVID or remote work, but like the idea of processing systems and processes and documentation, that's always existed in business, right? And so
Absolutely.
Loom is so good for that. So
yeah.
What's your superpower? What's the one thing you think you do better than anyone else?
I am called an organizational ninja a lot. I think when people see into my mind palace of how I organize information, I'm like building spreadsheets and building just proposals and stuff like that. They're like, wow, you this is different. Like, this is not normal. I'm like, oh, it's not. So yeah, information management and information organization, that's my jam.
Cool. And the last one, then, I like to learn from other leaders. Who are the mentors or leaders that have inspired and that you've learned from, whether you know them or you've read about them?
Yeah. So this is funny. I am an old soul, and I think that it shows one in this answer. One of my favorite business leaders and business examples is Johnny Appleseed. I think that he is such a genius, because what he did was thought very proactively about what are people going to need when they settle a new town or a new settlement that they won't be able to create for themselves immediately. And it was apples. Like, everybody needs apples, and it's critical in the diets of many people, but it takes years to start getting an apple. So I'm going to think ahead and go to these up and coming places, plant the seeds of what they are going to need in the future, but they don't know that they need yet. So that's really fueled a lot of the work that I do, especially as we are developing the remote work industry. I'm always trying to think ahead of, like, what do people need that they don't know that they need yet?
That's so good. I love that. And you were doing that, which makes when those 6,000% increase in leads came in, you were probably ready. You were ready to help them. So that's great. Laurel, how do people get in touch with you, or where should they connect with you if they want to look into distribute or just follow you online?
Yeah. Well, it's pretty easy to find me. I'm the only Laurel Farrer on both Twitter and LinkedIn. So those are great places to start, but they're also welcome to contact me on our websites, which are distributeconsulting.com and remoteworkassociation.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This is a great conversation.
Yeah, it was so good to see you again. And thanks for a great chat.
Yeah, you take care.
Thanks,
Bye.
John. Bye.
All right, this concludes our conversation with Laurel about remote work. What an awesome episode. I love her vision for the future of remote work. It's really inspiring to me, and she clearly knows her stuff. So if your team needs any help, make sure to reach out to her and the team at Distribute Consulting. Thanks again for listening to the Leadmore podcast, and we'll be back as we release new episodes every Thursday. Take care.